Introduction. When the walls fell. Every life, every community, and even every vision depends on certain walls, boundaries of discipline, faith, and order that keep what is valuable safe and allow what is growing to mature. These walls may not be made of stone, but they serve the same purpose. They define what belongs within and protect it from what should stay without. When such walls stand firm, people flourish. They dream boldly, build confidently, and rest in the assurance that their labor will not be in vain. But when those walls fall, even the strongest hearts begin to live cautiously. Progress becomes fragile, and fear begins to dictate every choice. Just as a city's walls mark its strength and security, so do the unseen boundaries in a person's life mark the depth of their stability. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." The heart here is not just a seat of emotion, but the center of thought, conviction, and discipline, the invisible wall that governs what flows in and what flows out. When that wall is guarded, purpose thrives. When it is breached, confusion and weakness enter. God Himself established the principle of boundaries from the beginning. In Genesis 1:4, when He created light, God divided the light from the darkness. Creation only took shape after order was established through separation. Boundaries were not a restriction, they were a design for fruitfulness. Likewise, every area of life that will flourish must have its own walls of discipline and order. A home grows in peace when trust and respect are the walls that hold it. A leader succeeds when integrity surrounds his position like a fortified city. A nation prospers when justice and righteousness are its boundaries. When those walls are ignored or broken, decay begins quietly before it ever becomes visible. Samson's story in Judges 16 is one such example. Though he was anointed and powerful, the absence of self controlled the wall that should have protected his strength became his downfall. His fall didn't begin when Delilah cut his hair. It began when he allowed the walls of consecration to crumble. By the time his enemies entered, the gate had long been open. History gives us similar reminders. An example is the collapse of the Roman Empire, one of the mightiest civilizations in history. It did not fall in a single night. Its decline began when the moral and civic walls that once held it together were weakened by corruption, indulgence, and internal decay. The walls of Rome's cities stood for a while, but the walls of character and discipline within her leaders had already fallen. In more recent times, corporate scandals like Enron in the early 2000s tell the same story. Brilliant people built vast structures of success, yet their lack of ethical boundaries caused the entire empire to collapse almost overnight. The issue wasn't skill or intelligence, it was the absence of walls. Every fall, whether personal or collective, begins with a breach. The breach may not be visible at first, but over time it widens until everything inside becomes exposed. That is why the psalmist prayed in Psalm 51:18, "Do good in thy good pleasure unto Zion. Build thou the walls of Jerusalem." He wasn't speaking of stone, but of inner renewal. He understood that no true restoration could last unless the inner walls of righteousness were rebuilt. When these invisible walls of faith, discipline, and truth stand, a person or a people can rise with confidence. They can create, build, and dream without the constant fear of collapse. But once those walls fall, even the most gifted lives begin to shrink under the pressure of insecurity. What once was courage becomes caution, and what was once strength becomes survival. That picture of insecurity and vulnerability perfectly describes the state of Jerusalem in the days of Nehemiah. The city, once regarded as the dwelling place of God and the pride of His people, had been reduced to a haunting image of loss. The glory that once drew nations had faded, and what remained was a community struggling to live among the ruins of what used to be. Streets that were once filled with the sound of celebration were now silent. The Temple Mount, once radiant with worship, stood bare. What was once a beacon to the nations had become a shadow of what disobedience can do to destiny. Long before Nehemiah entered the story, the people of Judah had already drifted far from the covenant that sustained them. The decline did not begin with fire and sword. It began in the quiet place of their hearts. They ignored the prophets who cried out in warning, turning deaf ears to voices like Jeremiah's, who pleaded, "Stand in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way, and walk therein?" Jeremiah 6:16. Yet they chose their own way, preferring convenience to consecration. Worship became routine, the altar became neglected, and the fear of God was replaced by the pride of self-sufficiency. Their hearts fell long before their walls did. By the time Babylon rose against them under King Nebuchadnezzar, the nation's strength had already been hollowed out by disobedience. What looked like a military defeat was really a spiritual one. The enemy only invaded what was already unguarded. The strength of a people who forsake divine order always fades, not in a single moment of collapse, but through the gradual erosion of truth, integrity, and reverence. God's presence had once been their fortress, but when his laws were despised, the walls became mere stones, majestic yet empty. Scripture captures the moment of devastation in 2 Kings 25:9-10, saying, "And he burnt the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and brake down the walls round about Jerusalem." That simple record hides a depth of sorrow. The house of God was gone, the royal palace reduced to ashes, and the city's protective wall symbols of its dignity and safety lay scattered in ruins. In one dreadful moment, the physical condition of Jerusalem mirrored the spiritual condition of its people. What had fallen on the outside was only the echo of what had long fallen within. Imagine the silence that followed. No songs of ascent rising from the temple courts, no priestly trumpets calling to worship. The people walked among broken stones, each one a reminder of their lost communion with God. The psalmist, overwhelmed by grief, wrote in Psalm 137:1-4, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion." The exile was not just geographical, it was emotional, spiritual, and generational. The songs of joy had turned to laments, and their harps hung silent upon the willows. For the remnant that remained in Jerusalem, survival became their only goal. They lived within open spaces that once offered safety, but now invited danger. Traders feared to prosper, lest robbers come. Families hesitated to rebuild because their labor could be destroyed overnight. The city that was meant to reflect the order and glory of God became a symbol of desolation. In every sense, the broken walls had turned Jerusalem into a city of quiet defeat. Yet even in that silence, God's plan was not finished. Every ruin that history records is also an invitation for divine rebuilding. The fall of Jerusalem was tragic, but it set the stage for one of the most remarkable restorations in Scripture: the rise of a man who wept, prayed, and built again. Decades later, when Nehemiah received the report of Jerusalem's condition, he was far from the city's dust and silence. He served in the royal palace of Persia as the king's cupbearer, a trusted position that demanded loyalty, composure, and wisdom. Yet when his brother Hanani brought the news of the city's ruins, Nehemiah's heart broke. The words of Nehemiah 1:3-4 tell us the weight of that moment. "The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." Nehemiah's response shows the heart of a man who did not deny pain or dismiss problems with haste. His first reaction was not to gather workers or request funds, but to sit, to weep, and to pray. He allowed the burden to settle deeply within him until he could carry it to God. That is how divine solutions begin, through the heart that feels before it acts. In many ways, Nehemiah's tears mirrored the heart of Jesus centuries later. When Jesus approached Jerusalem and saw its spiritual decay, Luke 19:41 says, "He wept over it." Both men were moved not by self-interest, but by compassion for God's people and the desire to see restoration. Tears can be powerful when they are poured before God. They become the seed of transformation. Nehemiah's prayerful response also reminds us of the promise in Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. His mourning was not weakness, it was preparation. God often begins his greatest works through those who are willing to feel the weight of a broken world. An example of this truth can be seen in the story of William Wilberforce, the 18th century British politician who fought for the abolition of the slave trade. When Wilberforce first learned about the cruelty of slavery, he was overwhelmed. He wept and fasted before God, struggling between his comfortable political career and the moral burden he felt. Like Nehemiah, his tears became his turning point. That season of prayer gave birth to a lifetime of purpose that eventually transformed a nation and ended centuries of oppression. Nehemiah's reaction teaches a principle every problem solver must learn. Before you act, you must see clearly. Before you speak, you must listen. Before you move, you must seek God's direction. His pain became his call, and his prayer became the blueprint for restoration. There is something profoundly strategic about how Nehemiah began. Many people equate leadership with quick action, but Nehemiah's strength lay in his restraint. He understood that wisdom does not grow in haste. It grows in quiet spaces where emotion has time to settle and vision can take shape. By pausing to pray, he was not delaying progress, he was preparing for it. His waiting was not weakness, it was construction in another form. In stillness, he was laying the foundation of clarity before the first stone of the wall would ever be lifted. That is where every true rebuilding must begin, not with motion, but with meaning. When a wall falls, whether moral, relational, or spiritual, the first response should not be to rebuild blindly. It is to sit before God long enough to understand what went wrong and why it matters. Nehemiah shows that strategy begins in stillness. Before you can plan, you must perceive. Before you can lead others, you must first let God lead your thoughts. The broken walls of Jerusalem stand for more than a moment in history. They represent the condition of any life, family, or system that has lost its order and protection. When the walls fall, creativity fades because fear takes its place. When the walls fall, effort yields little because what is good becomes exposed and vulnerable. Yet the story of Nehemiah reminds us that ruins are not the end. The same way he rose to rebuild the city's walls, every person can rise to rebuild what has been lost if they are willing to pause, to see clearly, and to seek divine guidance. Rebuilding does not begin with brick and mortar. It begins with understanding, with honest reflection, and with a renewed vision of what could be. Nehemiah's story is not just about a city restored, it is about a mind transformed. It reminds us that before God restores what is broken around us, He first strengthens what is weak within us. And that is the first lesson of this journey. The fall of the walls may be a story of loss, but it is also the starting point of strategy. Part 1. The mind of a strategist. Every great work begins in the mind before it takes shape in the world. What separates those who react from those who rebuild is how they think. Nehemiah's story shows that true leadership is not first about doing, but about discerning. Long before he lifted a stone or organized a team, he learned to listen to God, to the situation, and to his own spirit. When Nehemiah heard that Jerusalem's walls were broken and its gates burned, his response revealed something rare. He did not rush into action. He paused. He prayed. He reflected. That pause was not hesitation. It was the moment when purpose began to take form in his mind. This section explores that inner process, the mind of a strategist. It is where vision is shaped, perspective is refined, and direction is born. Every problem solver must first learn what Nehemiah knew, that strategy begins in stillness, and that the greatest plans are not formed in haste, but in wisdom. Before the hands can build, the mind must see. Before the work can rise, the heart must understand. Nehemiah teaches us that rebuilding anything, whether a wall, a life, or a nation, starts not with motion, but with